So, good morning, everybody. We've given 10 minutes for people to get over their hangovers and get into the session, but I think we've given long enough. So we'll start with this select audience. I mean, you're the guys that are most interested in the session, so we won't delay any longer, and we'll start off. So we're talking about access to opportunity in remote and rural areas, and of course this is in many countries a neglected sector, and transport in rural and more remote communities is often a limiting factor for opportunities for employment, for essential services, and it's often accounts for a disproportionately large share of expenditure for households compared to the national average. And in our more wealthy member countries, we've seen in quite a few of them decades now of underinvestment, cuts in bus services, and of course in some of the lowest income member countries of the ITF, we have a lot of these areas where they don't even have all-weather roads serving the communities. So there are major challenges, a lot that needs to be done, but there are solutions that transport ministries can be part of in improving access for these communities, and we've got a great panel to discuss some of the approaches that can be taken, and we want to hear from you as well, so I'll open up as often as possible for all of you to join into the discussion. So we have Neil Peterson, who many of you know, the Executive Director of the US Transportation Board, part of the National Academy of Sciences and the US government's premier transport research agency. Linda Ristagno, who's an Associate Director of the International Air Transport Association, and she leads IATA's work in improving accessibility for people with disabilities, mobility impairments, and all of us as we get older, using air services. We have Emma McLennan, out of order, just here next to me, who's the founder and the CEO of the Eastern Alliance for Sustainable Transport that works with NGOs across Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, working on sustainable mobility and on road safety, and working a lot with rural communities and isolated communities. And Christina Yasionaite, who's Managing Director at the World Bicycle Relief, which is an extremely interesting NGO that's providing robust bicycles in places where they're the most effective form of transport for communities. And Daniel Blay, who's a Senior VP for Africa of Zipline, which is an extremely interesting company on the cutting edge of technology, running drone services to remote areas across Africa. So I won't introduce you again as we go along, that's enough. So if we'll kick off with Neil, who's has been working quite a lot on policy responses for mitigating the issues across the vast country of the USA, a lot of different environments. So Neil, if you kick us off.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here this morning to talk about this very important topic. So we think, and I really like the diversity that we have in terms of the panel here. So I'm going to be speaking primarily from the perspective of a highly developed country, but one that has vast rural areas and very significant challenges as well. So I want to start just by setting a context for the United States on this. And I always find when we get into discussions like this, it's very important that we have definitions of what is rural, because what I might think of being rural in the US might be very different than what Daniel thinks of it being in Africa, for example. So in the US, the census has actually defined rural populations as anyone who lives outside an urban area of 2,500 population or greater. So in the United States, that's 19% of our population, but 97% of the land area of the US is considered rural. So very, very vast areas, which ends up creating a number of the challenges that I'll talk about. In terms of safety, which is number one priority, obviously, for everyone in transportation, if we look at the non-interstate or non-motorway traffic in rural areas, the fatality rate is over twice as high as it is on other roadways in the United States. So traffic safety ends up being a very significant issue. We also have issues in terms of the condition of the infrastructure itself. Not having as much population or funding available, especially a lot of the bridges have become a problem. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Population is decreasing in rural areas, and it is getting older, which creates challenges for us as well. So in terms of the road safety issues, a lot of the rural roadways are not designed to the same standards as in more developed areas that have developed more recently, and the roadways have been built to higher standards. Often they ended up basically developing from old wagon trails that existed even before automobiles. And we have very significant problems, especially in terms of run-off-the-road accidents. We have recognized from a policy perspective that we really need to be applying what's called a safe systems approach. I don't know how many of you have heard of that, but it's a recognition that although driver error may be a contributing factor, we have to have forgiving roadways, that when there is a driver error, that it doesn't result in a fatal crash. We also are looking at a lot of technology improvements, particularly in terms of lane keeping, for example, that will help address that. In terms of, excuse me, infrastructure itself, 8% of rural bridges are rated poor or structurally deficient, but 47% are only rated fair. So fair in the United States means that probably before very long they're going to have significant problems. And it is both based on the age of the bridges. We have a lot of very old bridges, as well as disinvestment, not enough money being set aside. So some of you may have heard that there was a major infrastructure bill that was actually passed by our Congress and signed by the President in December of last year. And there's actually a major set aside in terms of addressing this issue of bridges, particularly within rural areas, and especially those that are owned by local jurisdictions, which often do not have the tax base to be able to make the investments that are necessary. Another major issue for rural populations in the U.S. is that we still have a very large portion of the population that does not own a car, and in 40% of rural residents in the U.S. actually live in a county that does not have public transportation of any type whatsoever. And in many of the other counties, the primary public transportation that is provided is social service transportation that's often provided by many different agencies, not well coordinated at all. So that raises policy issues in terms of how we can be having more coordinated public service transit, but also a recognition that for many of those who do not own cars, we've heard a lot during the course of the last 2 days about the informal transportation networks that exist in a lot of the world. That also is in many rural counties in the United States. The people without cars depend upon others who do have cars and informal networks that are in place. So again, from a policy perspective, there has been a recognition on the part of the federal government that both in the previous administration and this administration that we really do need to be prioritizing investments by our federal government in ensuring that there is adequate funding for rural transit systems to be provided in the rural areas itself. Another major challenge is we depend upon our rural areas for many of the agricultural goods and in fact, for many manufactured goods and many of the raw materials as well. But the transportation from those areas has the goods movement transportation has been challenged. In the United States, we've had a lot of consolidation of our rail companies, for example, so there is relatively little competition now in many of the rural areas that ends up increasing the prices. Becomes a major regulatory issue that that is being addressed, but obviously you can tell it's very controversial with the rail companies as well. So major policy issues related to that as well. and a recognition on the part of our federal government, again, in terms of the discretionary grant programs that they have. And especially in our recent infrastructure bill, we have a lot of money going into discretionary grant programs, that there needs to be a priority given to a portion of that going to rural areas. Rural areas, rural governments often do not have the expertise to be able to make applications for discretionary grants. So even this issue of providing technical assistance to rural governments for some of the discretionary grant money that is available. Obviously, together with the rest of the world, the United States is really focused right now on decarbonization and moving to electric vehicles. Electric vehicle charging infrastructure is a major challenge, especially in rural areas where the market will not, on its own, be providing for that electric vehicle infrastructure, charging infrastructure. But without it, we're going to have, a lot of people are going to be reluctant to buy electric vehicles if they have to be traveling to rural areas. So again, from a policy perspective, there's been a major emphasis in the new infrastructure bill on ensuring funding for electric charging infrastructure for rural areas. And I'm just going to wrap up with a point that I just made earlier, and that is that in many rural counties, many rural jurisdictions in the United States, public works or transportation may have a staff of 1 or 2 people. And they don't have the technical expertise that really is necessary. So this whole issue of how do we provide the technical expertise to rural jurisdictions, not just for grant applications, but just in terms of the expertise that they need, even for things like bridge design, for replacing all of those bridges owned by local governments as well. And again, I think there's been a recognition from a policy perspective that there's an obligation on the part of our federal government to ensure that that technical expertise is being made available. So I realize it's been a menu of issues that I have raised, but many challenges clearly from a rural perspective in a highly developed country. And it's going to be interesting to hear the contrast now with some of the less developed countries and issues there as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Neil. That's raised a lot of issues and maybe stimulated some of you to want to come in immediately before we go into some of the other areas. So, Steve Phillips, take my mic.
Thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Neil. I think that was great. Yeah, I mean, we need to follow up. What I would suggest, and maybe this has been a bit provocative, and I know you're not a kind of provocative guy, but I like to be from time to time. Okay, most of us are fairly apolitical and we're non-political. But what you were talking about actually resonated with me in terms of, you mentioned governance, you also mentioned definitions. And this is something I would posit maybe is we have an issue where in many countries the definition of urban and remote often is defined not by physical characteristics but by political lines drawn on a map. We see the governance around cities, and then we have the disenfranchised, the people who don't vote or vote in a completely different jurisdiction and therefore have no say on the transport. I would also, I think the elephant in the room, we're also observing where a lot of the rural areas actually are developing, should we say, different political orientations than many of the urban areas. And we're seeing that is causing stress in many, many countries. And so the rural areas are from time to time are maybe at the top of the list, other times at the bottom of the list. So in terms of your governance question, I guess I'll be looking at how can we as totally apolitical, as advisors, as public servants or whatever, how can we seek, how can we influence and ensure this, you know, avoiding political bias, shall I say?
You do like to be provocative, don't you, Steve? So, just many of you may not understand the Transportation Research Board and how we fit in the United States. So I need to say that as context. So we are actually independent of the federal government. And one of the things that we really take pride in is the fact that we are apolitical and independent of the federal government and nonpartisan. So I have to say that as context for my response. But we do also really go out of our way in terms of trying to identify what the most important issues are. And we identified actually rural transportation issues even before the last administration in the US, when we had a Democratic administration, as an area where we had some very significant issues and very significant challenges. Some of the very issues that I have gone over have been issues for quite a long time, and recognition that we really do need to be addressing those issues. Now, we have gone from an administration that represented many rural areas. That's the rural states were the ones that primarily voted Republican in the 2016 election, to an administration that now is Democratic, primarily elected by more urban areas. But this administration has again recognized that we have big challenges, and part of it is education. Part of it is helping those who are in urban areas understand how important it is for the products that they are receiving, whether it is agricultural products, the food that they're eating, whether it's the raw materials that are coming from rural areas. And I think actually the supply chain crisis has ended up helping educate our urban population in terms of the importance of rural transportation issues.
Okay, thanks. We've got two more interventions here, and then we'll just take two here, and then we'll move on. But don't feel obliged to ask a question. And you can always put solutions on the table too. So first you,
That's
and
what
then
I want.
David, and then we'll see if we need a response or if we're done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not coming from the policy side. I'm coming from a foundation, Total Mobility Foundation. We're looking in action. And one thing I think, and maybe later on we follow up because I don't want to take time from the panel. We have the solutions today. We have digital solutions, we have energy solutions, and I want to show you later on, maybe those who are interested, example from northern Germany, the Dutch border, where rural area took their fates in their own hand. Two farmers started 20 years ago a business, and they're rebuilding agricultural land to new energy. And that sparks development. A pig stall is now the place for other workers in there. And this is an opportunity not only for the developed world, also particularly Africa. Really producing energy to very cheap cost, renewable energy, is offering great opportunities. So maybe later on we can follow up.
Can you just introduce yourself so people can find you?
Sorry, I'm Andy Fuchs to the Mobility Foundation, and later on we can have more.
Okay, and if you could pass the mic behind.
Yeah, thanks, David Wood from the Towards Zero Foundation. I think it was a great introduction. I'd just like to flag up a concern I have, which is that, and I don't want to make this too polarized, but actually for the last decade or so, there's been an extraordinary urban bias to a lot of transport policy thinking. I should also declare we're funded by the Bloomberg Philanthropy, the work of vehicle safety, and of course they've been pioneering the championing of cities and all of that. And actually, but I do think that there's been a price to pay for this urban bias, because the reality in most parts of the world, if you take road safety, the highest fatality rates are in rural areas. The challenges in the energy transition, transport transition are highest in rural areas. And coming back to now I'm going to stray into some politics. Beware of neglecting rural areas. Where is the core base of appalling populists like Trump? Rural areas. So we've actually got to handle this very cleverly, and we've got to avoid a sort of urban-rural dichotomy, try and bring these together. Perhaps because of the pandemic, there is a new opportunity. People are beginning to contemplate less urban concentration. Maybe that's the best chance that rural areas have to avoid being the last in the queue for sustainable transport. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Well, I think we have an agreement rather than requiring a response there. And if we have time in a second round for the panel, maybe we can come back for some of the road safety issues and talk about what would be the priority, what are the priorities that you see for implementing a safe system in the rural areas, because as David said, most of our focus has been recently on the urban areas. But let's hold that, and if we have time, let's come back to that with a bit more detail, because we have a few people here that know a lot about road safety. So it would be very useful to get some clues for our work. But now I'd quickly like to move on to Linda, who we had, but we're going to hold it? Or do you really want to come in now? I mean, feel free. No, go ahead.
Hi, I'm from the Ministry of Transport in New Zealand, and we have very similar issues, though very different sized population. I wondered if this policy shift you're seeing with the focus on rural, is it just a passing phase? Have you thought about a kind of definition for access and how much access you give? Because some countries are moving towards a kind of definition of access and a minimum access right, which I think we might struggle with in New Zealand. So I'm wondering if in the US you've thought about it.
I'm not sure that I have the answer. But I mean, you did definitely raise a very, very important issue. And one of the things that we have definitely observed in the US is as the rural population is aging, this whole issue of access for the aged population in rural areas has become a huge, huge challenge. And has to be a priority from a policy perspective as well. And it's going to be costly, there's no question about it. And the local jurisdictions usually don't have the financial wherewithal to be doing it, so it has to be coming from higher levels of government.
Thanks. And Linda, just before we go to you, Emma, I think you'd like to come in on the same point. Just talk.
Just talk, okay. Hopefully you can hear me. Well, I'm dropping my papers everywhere. Very good question, how you measure access. And absolutely, the elderly population are the most affected, people with disabilities very affected. I think you need to go out and talk to them and do some measurements. As you'll hear in my presentation later, we've been doing some travel diaries in remote rural areas in different parts of the world. And I think you also need to think in these days about digital access. Is there meaningful digital access for people in rural areas? Do they have internet access? Are there places where they can do this cheaply, freely? Those are important issues for social and economic participation. So I think this is an issue that's really fundamentally important and will run and run. But I'll say more when I speak a bit later on.
Thank you.
I think I can come to this.
Linda, go ahead.
Because it's interesting. What is, for example, you know, we always say that aviation is about connectivity and also accessibility and freedom. The definition that we have for accessibility and access, for example, by looking at persons with disabilities and the aging population, is mostly about how we make sure that we provide the freedom to those passengers to travel with safety, dignity, and respect. I represent aviation, and aviation really for us is about freedom to travel. We connect the world. And I agree as well about the dichotomy. It's not about thinking of access in remote areas. It's about thinking of access for everywhere. A person who is disabled, a passenger who is disabled or is growing old, and we have Japan, for example, they have the highest numbers of, I think it's 26% or even more of the population who is growing old. And it's a problem. So how we can, well, it's not a problem, it's an opportunity actually. How we can make sure that we provide the same access to those passengers, to those travelers and tourists as well, to travel the world. So what we are doing in aviation in IATA, first of all, accessibility for passengers with disabilities and what we call the silver economy, so the aging population, is one of the top priorities for us. Because we are thinking to the future. Aviation of the future will not be the same of how it is today. We are doing improvements in the sense of changing the infrastructures, and also there will be regulations. In the United States, there is a notice or proposed rulemaking how to make aircraft accessible, single-aisle aircraft accessible with lavatories, for example, for passengers who have a mobility disability. But it's just one of the issues that we have to solve. This is really about infrastructures. That's why for us accessibility is how to make sure that infrastructures are accessible for those people who have a disability, but are disabled by the way that we don't welcome them on aviation. In this case, I talk for aviation. What we need to do, for example, is also to create this connection with other modes of transport. Because aviation, in this case, in remote areas or in landlocked countries or in rural area, is just one of the leg. What about the others? I mean, what about the elders joining, for example, the airport? If there are not roads, if there is no shared mobility, for example, how we can make sure that we can support them? When they are at the airports, or also, for example, for persons with a disability, mobility disability or invisible disability, how we can make sure that they understand of the touch points, or we can make accessible for them the airport navigation. So it's really complex. We are, as I said before, for us is really a top priority in IATA and for our members. We represent something like 300 members, and because it's not only the right thing to do, it's a social right. Right? Accessibility is a social right. Travel, it's a right. Freedom. But it's also, it makes business sense. So how we can make sure that in the future we welcome the large part of the population, but with safety, dignity, and respect. So that is my...
Yeah. I think, Emma, you wanted to come on that point as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I think that's so important. Actually, a thing I heard the other day is that by 2050, half of the population of Singapore will be over 60. So you can just imagine the challenges. And actually, the silver population growing is a problem mostly around a lot of developing countries, but also underdeveloped countries. And we've been doing work specifically trying to map what the problems are of access among people with different sorts of disabilities and elderly people as part of our work. And it started really because in Moldova we saw that there weren't people with disabilities visible on the roads. And we asked why. And people I knew in Moldova were saying, well, we don't have many people with disabilities. I said, no, that will not be true. So we went out and we found them, and we spoke to organizations representing people with disabilities, and we found they were locked in their homes. They were afraid to go out. They could not go out physically. And so we've started doing surveys with some of our partner countries, and this is shown precisely that. In Kyrgyzstan, 93% of people with disabilities had never taken public transport because they felt it was impossible to take public transport. And in Azerbaijan, 56% of people had never used their brand new metro system because it was inaccessible to them. And then in Moldova, as I mentioned, over half of people said that it was difficult or impossible for them to get around and do essential tasks like going to the doctor, going to schools, going to education facilities. So that's a big chunk of the population, and these are people who have skills, who are educated. Actually, as a result of some survey work, one of our partners started going out and hiring people with disabilities because they were skilled, available, tremendous characters. And this is a wasted economic opportunity. So it is something we need to address. Thank you.
And I know, Neil, you've been working on one small part of the issue, wheelchair access to large passenger jets. I don't know if you want to say a few things about that.
So the U.S. Congress actually asked the Transportation Research Board to do a study on the feasibility for large, for aircraft, passenger aircraft, to be able to accommodate the heavy wheelchairs that are used by those with disability. So often today, if someone who has one of these power wheelchairs wants to travel on an aircraft, they actually have to be lifted into their seats, which can be very painful, and then their power wheelchair gets put in the cargo hold and often ends up being damaged. So it really creates a big challenge for the disabled community to be able to travel by air. So we were actually asked to look at what the feasibility was of being able, for aircraft being able to accommodate these power wheelchairs. And basically, as they are on public transit vehicles, be locked in place. We did end up concluding, in terms of the structural integrity of aircraft, that, as well as in terms of how the doors are configured, that it would be possible for both Boeing 737s and A320s, which are the vast majority of the aircraft, at least in the US, for passenger travel, to be able to accommodate power wheelchairs. There's still an issue in terms of if a crash occurs, what the safety issues are that have to be looked at a little bit more. And obviously, we were not asked to look at, does it make economic sense? That is something that was outside the scope of what we were looking at. But it was a very significant conclusion that is now leading to the policy debate within the US in terms of whether, particularly for those type of aircraft, the airlines will be required to be able to accommodate individuals with power wheelchairs. I don't know if you want to add commentary to that.
Yes. Yeah.
Just talk, and it'll come.
It's off. Yeah. No, it comes. Ah, good. They are in control. Good. Yeah. It's a research. It's true. We have looked at this as well. Our perspective is this will be feasible in the future. There are still some safety constraints associated to that, with, as you said, the crash test, because that has not been done yet, because there are no prototypes. There are still not wheelchairs. Well, wheelchairs are very, very much built around the need of the person. Some wheelchairs can weigh up to 150 kilos, more or less. That is a huge weight. So we welcomed actually this research because there has been a big movement around the world about the restraint system of a powered, especially battery-powered wheelchairs in the cabin. Actually, we had asked as well that were some consistent research, and we thank the Transport Research Board for this. There are still some, it's work ongoing. For sure, this will be the future. But the problem probably is accommodating a passenger with his own wheelchair on the air cabin, in the cabin. It means that one passenger can travel. What about if you have 4, 5 passengers who are on a wheelchair? You have to still have systems to make sure that those passengers can travel, again, with dignity, respect, and safely, mostly. And at the same time, make sure that those wheelchairs are loaded in the cargo belly, in the belly of the aircraft, and are safe and are secured, so the wheelchairs don't get damaged. That's why work needs to be done on the standardization of the mobility aid itself. That is a very technical issue, and some standardization like RESNA. It's a standardization body in the United States with whom we are working closely. Is looking at. But certainly this is the future. I'm not sure the future will be really the passenger traveling with his own wheelchair, or a seat system that is more comfortable for the passenger and doesn't bring to injuries, or also how to safely transfer, for example, the passenger from the wheelchair to the seat. It's a very complicated issue, but it's good that we started researching this.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. And as you were explaining to me yesterday, for the areas we're talking about now here today is the rural and more remote areas. You're using very small planes to service those areas, and thinking that you can have the solution that may work for big heavy jets in a small plane is just, that's not the answer there. So we have a particularly difficult problem where we have very thin air services serving these remote areas, which are often not profitable. They're supported by government. If you had to put bigger jets on there, where's the subsidy coming from? So if I could turn the whole problem on its head now and switch to Daniel, maybe you can bring some of the essential services to the people rather than people having to move to get to the essential services. So Daniel, if you want to tell us a bit about, first of all, the I don't know if it's a business or I think it's self-sustaining, but explain what you do and then take us on to how it can help these communities.
Sure. So Zipline is a commercial business. We run the largest commercial drone delivery service in the world. And the way I see it is there's kind of two aspects of mobility. So mobility of people and mobility of products. Zipline is focused on the mobility of products. So can we get people in rural and remote communities access to products that they really need exactly when they need it? So I'll maybe just start by providing a little bit of an introduction about how Zipline works, because I think there can be a lot of confusion and disbelief in the drone space. It's also quite a crowded space. But Zipline's drones are maybe not exactly what you think of when you think of a drone. So they're a fixed wing aircraft. So the wingspan of the aircraft is about 2 meters. They've got an 160 kilometer range and a top speed of 110 kilometers per hour. So it's more like a very small unmanned aircraft. We set up these distribution centers in countries. And so you can think of it as a very, very small airport for drones. And from the moment the drone leaves this airport, it's completely autonomous. So the drone flies to its destination between 100 and 200 meters in the air. So, if you look up, it's difficult to see and it's silent, doesn't make any noise, at least no audible noise from the ground. And when it reaches its destination, a chute opens in the belly of the drone. And a package drops, which has a parachute attached to it. And so the drone descends to about 30 meters when it actually drops this package. And the package descends to the drone suspended by a parachute. And at that point, the drone just turns around automatically and goes back to the drone airport. So that's the basics of how it works. In terms of our scale, so we've done just over 300,000 deliveries and 200,000 deliveries in the last year. So we're growing pretty rapidly. The majority of our deliveries are taking place in Ghana and Rwanda. So Rwanda was our first market, launched in 2015, fully operational in 2016, and we expanded to Ghana in 2019. This year, we're also expanding to Nigeria. So we've just completed the build out of our first distribution center in Kaduna State. And we're also currently building additional distribution centers in Cross River and Bayelsa State. In addition to that, we're launching in the Ivory Coast and also Kenya. We've just started construction of our first distribution center in Kisumu, which is in Western Kenya. If you take Rwanda as an example, we've got 2 distribution centers in Muhanga and Kayonza, and those 2 distribution centers can do about 300 deliveries a day each, and they can deliver across the entire country. So we're servicing 500 health centers across Rwanda. If you take Ghana, we've got 6 operational distribution centers, and we're building another 2. So those 6 centers are currently servicing 2,000 health facilities. If you think about the problem that Zipline solves, over the last few years, we've been very focused on the medical use case. And so when it comes to the distribution of medical products, you can take blood as an example. There's 8 blood groups and negative and positive rhesus factors. And there's a big problem with waste. And so if you take Ghana or even developed countries, something between 3 to 7% of blood products are actually thrown out because you've got this mismatch between supply and demand. So if you want people to have access to blood products or really any scarce, temperature-controlled, short shelf life product, well, you've got to distribute it broadly if you want people to have access to it. But then you naturally run into a problem with waste, because if you want people to have access to it, you need to overstock at the last mile. So how do you actually solve that? So Zipline solves it by centralizing distribution, but then allowing all of the facilities we serve to have access to the product within roughly 45 minutes. So in Rwanda, from our 2 distribution centers, we can service 500 facilities within 45 minutes. So if you take blood or you take vaccines or potentially other use cases as well, by centralizing storage and distributing on demand, you can dramatically decrease waste in the system. So, 7% of blood products wasted before Zipline. After Zipline, it's close to 0 in Rwanda and Ghana. You can start to solve that problem of waste within the medical system. But Zipline is not just limited to medical products anymore. So over the last 6 months, we've been expanding into agriculture and livestock. And so we're now using our system in Rwanda to distribute pig semen. And it sounds kind of random, why would you use this system to distribute pig semen? But, it's a product that when you need it, you really need it. So pigs are in heat between 8 and 36 hours. Pig semen is a temperature-controlled product, and it's got a very short shelf life of up to 4 days. So how do you actually get pig semen to farmers very quickly, like within hours? Well, a system that centralizes storage and distributes the product on demand when farmers need it is, a great solution to that problem. So this year, we're really closely looking at additional use cases beyond just the medical use case, where Zipline system can add value. But there's kind of a couple of different ways that it integrates with ground transportation as well. So I'm happy to take questions, but also happy to hand over.
The ground integration is actually an interesting part of it, getting into the communities in the remoter areas. And I know you've been working on more obvious public health cases, delivering vaccines into the more difficult to reach areas. So people can ask questions about that and we can come back to it. But Christina, if you want to take us on to then what happens, you get the vaccine or the blood into the local area, but then you still have to go further, the last mile at the receiving end.
That's it. Thanks, Steve. And that's right. So talking after drones about bicycles, one might wonder, bicycles, probably not the first thing that we think about life-changing technology, right? Yet this unassuming mode of transportation for those people in rural, isolated areas can be very much life-changing, and it can sometimes even mean the difference between surviving and thriving. In isolated areas, the simple fact of owning a bicycle can really mean that if someone has access to school, if someone has access to clinic, to the market, to the voting station, to any courses that are being organized in sustainable agriculture or whatever, so any essentials that typically are out of reach. Because for those who have no other means of transportation as their own feet, the reach is very, very limited, and all the opportunities to change their lifestyle are really out of reach. Actually, World Bank estimates that 1 billion people in rural developing regions lack access to either reliable roads or affordable transportation. That's 1 out of 8 people around the globe, and including like 70% of Africa's rural population, and majority of them are women and girls. If we see at other research from World Bank, which estimates that if women and girls had like 12 years of quality education, that they could contribute an additional 30 trillion to the global economy. or the fact that if women and girls have access to education and healthcare, that this is one of the most effective solutions to protect climate change. It's actually, if you look at the rankings, more effective as solar panels and electric vehicles. So this is where we get excited at World Bicycle Relief, how bicycle can really help people connect to anything that's just out of reach if they have no other mode of transportation. So we did a randomized control trial in Zambia where we looked at what happens if girls have been provided bicycles, and what we found that girls' absenteeism decreases by 28%, punctuality increases by 68%, but also soft factors like self-esteem and their negotiation power, everything is increasing because now they feel like empowered, that they can really make their own decisions. And